One origami crane led to a string of terrifying encounters with a stalker who won't stop until she has her cranes. And I'm not sure I can escape this chilling game. Thank you for your subscription and likes. What would you do if it were you? You can leave your thoughts in the comments section. Chimed motorbikes revved in the distance. Rusted metal shop signs creaked in the wind. The scent of roasting meat and charcoal was in the air. Someone wretched in a distant alley of the metropolitan labyrinth. Dead-eyed women glared from billboards at amorous salarymen offering wishes to be granted for a price. A bicycle whizzed past. White headphones crammed into his ears. Someone tried to thrust a flyer into her hand without words. Red light, don't walk, her feet act, her clothes red of passive smoke. Another 10-hour shift was finally over. An old man cleared his throat while he stared at her. No words, just silent judgment. Green light, walk. Someone stepped on her foot without apology in the mad dash to be first across the road. Eyes peered over face masks. What's the purpose of that surgical contraption? To prevent germs or to hide gaunt expressions? Music blared beneath blacked-out windows of a sports car. Prices in bright neon lights vomited colors onto the crowded streets. She clutched her purse tightly. Someone rang their bicycle bell as if to demand she shift aside. She apologized, but the cyclist ignored her. Through the window of a noodle restaurant she saw rows of heads buried in bowls and a sweaty brow chef grinning up ahead. The green light was already blinking as she rounded the corner. She made a half-hearted dash to cross in time but winced and slowed as the light turned a bright red. Ayako felt the beginnings of a migraine looming like thunderclouds. On an autumn afternoon, electronic bells were continuing to ring in her ear, despite work being concluded for the day. The bells meant a customer's placed an order through the touch panel at their table. The bells meant hurry the customers. King ding dong, better move girl, better hurry, a voice, or she'll be in trouble. In an attempt to ignore her own garbled and exhausted thoughts, Aka craned her neck into a familiar downward position as she pulled out her smartphone. The bells, quasi-echo, she thought, while plugging her earphones into her ears, softly smiling in amusement. A bony finger prodded her in the back. She leapt in shock and pulled her earphones out, being the timorous type. She slightly cowered as she turned. Could you do something for me, Mississippi? I have a small request. If you were to fulfill it, we would be ever so grateful. Io thought there was only one person in front of her. A woman she guessed in her late 30s. In a long light brown coat, a face mask covered her mouth. Io imagined that her request would be something to do with money before she could prepare an excuse to refuse The stranger continued. Mia is in the hospital. She's been stricken with a very rare heart disease, and the doctors are baffled of how she may have caught it. She will undergo a form of surgery next week and we're praying for a safe procedure. There aren't many documented cases of this disease in the world, so at the very least we're nervous for Mia. My request isn't for money or sympathy. All I wish you to do is gift me an origami sea rain to ensure Mia has a speedy recovery. Could you do that? The stranger bowed her head and outstretched her arms, offering a notebook to Eiko. Please make one, she sharply whispered. Lily was moved by Kasumi's plight but slightly unnerved by the stranger's brazen and unusual request. This was the first person who had bothered to speak to her outside of her work colleagues since she had moved to Tokyo. It felt refreshing to speak to someone new, and the request wasn't exactly demanding. Well, of course I will, Io beamed. The stranger's eyes widened as Ayako delicately folded the torn-out sheet of notepaper. Ayako looked up nervously and smiled occasionally whenever she heard impressed noises escape from behind the face mask of her new friend. Despite it being July, wind chilled her fingers as they meticulously folded the wings of the crane. Ao sat it upright on the palm of her hand and offered it to the lady. What beautiful work, you can create such skill and dexterity. Lily was pleased that the small gesture seemed to have brightened the day of another. Well, I really must be going now. Please wish Mia all the best for me. I hope she gets better soon. Her new friend was still analyzing the crane, turning it in all directions in her hands. Eiko began to leave as the traffic light began blinking. Green. Io felt a hand grip around her wrist. I'm sorry. I just have one more thing to ask you. Please write your name and a little bit of information about yourself. I know Mia would love to one day thank you and anyone else who took the time to make a crane for her in her time of need. Seeing it as the fastest way to end this conversation and to be on her way home, she politely accepted. An old dirty notebook was handed to her. different to the one before. She flipped through the pages of the book to find a clean one. Hundreds of names and telephone numbers filling the faint blue lines was passed before her eyes. She added her own name and information and handed it back. The stranger snatched it out of her hands, uttered a quick word of thanks and turned her back on Ao and then disappeared into the crowd of oncoming Tokyoites in glimpses. Ao would see that brown coat appear momentarily between business suits and blouses. Only light rainfall snapped Ao out of the confusion created by the abrupt ending. She opened her umbrella and made her way home. Ao momentarily looked up from her textbooks to gaze numbly at the glowing digits of her digital clock. She had been studying all morning. She poured more coffee and made her way back to her desk. On the 25th of the month, Aiko would be sitting possibly the most important exam of her young life. Pressure was mounting. A pitter-patter of rain drummed her window. She rushed to her balcony to bring her work clothes inside, needing them for that evening. There just wasn't enough time for everything. A job studies a social life. As she hung her clothes in her wardrobe, she heard her phone buzzing beneath the pillow on her bed before falling silent. She checked the call log and there was a number of missed calls, 6 of which were voicemails. Her mind suddenly conjured images of her parents in hospital beds, while white-coated doctors loomed over them clutching clipboards. What other scenario would require such a demand of her attention? She hastily played the messages. I'm calling to see if you'll make another. Not many people are as kind-hearted as you see. The second message clicked to life. I'm calling again. Thank you for your support. Today was very slow. Could you make 3? The third message crackled. The tone panicked. She got worse overnight. I pray that you make 10. We are counting on you. The fourth message was shrill. I hope you've made a start because we need more. We need 15. This is important. A life is at stake. I hope you understand the severity of this. Io swallowed nervously as the fifth message played. I'm starting to think that you're not as kind as I thought. I'm not asking for a lot. 19. That's all. The last message began with rasped breaths before a snide voice filled the earpiece. You better have made a start. The initial relief in the knowledge that her parents weren't hurt was washed away by a new different disquieting feeling. As she pressed end, the phone immediately started buzzing again. Iko stared at it. A cold sweat amassed her brow. A percussion of raindrops on windows permeated the silence between each buzz. She had decided to answer it. Hello, what's taking so long? What are you doing? An angry voice hissed. Iko, still stunned, remained silent. Her eyes darted around the room. But don't you want Mia to get better? A light went on in Ayako's mind. That lady, the one who wanted that origami crane. It happened over a week ago. She barely remembered it. Io began. She rubbed the sweat from her forehead and adjusted her glasses. Make 27 more cranes. Get them ready for collection. The voice ordered aggressively. Iko managed the muster to ask who Forest Sumi. The voice screamed. Make sure they're perfect. Io heard a click, then a dial tone. The phone felt hot in her hand, so she threw it down on the bed. Ao stood there in silence for a moment, with her laundry still draped over her shoulder, staring at the phone. Later that evening the restaurant was exceptionally busy. Fat customers barked orders at Iko, but her mind was elsewhere. She raced back and forth with delivering food and drinks to different tables, all the while contemplating her new problem. Ella, a fellow server and the closest thing Ayako could call a friend, had noticed Io's demeanor, and during their shared break decided to ask about it with a heavy sigh. Io filled her in on the details and proceeded to play the voice messages for her. What should I do? Io asked with a tight smile and a breathy forced laugh. It was an attempt at mellowing the conversation. She didn't want Ero to know that the calls had occupied her mind with worry. Eriko chuckled, but her furrowed brow betrayed concern. She pushed her short hair behind her ears and replied honestly, I would just ignore it. She'll probably give up eventually, right? That's kind of harsh though. Maybe if I just talk to Ero, cut her off. If you talk to her, you give her oxygen. The more you give her, the more she'll take. The best way to avoid someone is to ignore them. And it starts right now. Erika reached over and plucked the phone from Ao's hands and turned it off. Quit worrying. No one calls anymore. No one really wants to talk to anyone nowadays. Anyway, I'm heading back out there. Don't turn that thing back on. Io smiled and exhaled through her nose. She twisted her long dark hair around her fingers alone in the break room. Contemplating Eriko's advice, shadows danced across apartment buildings projected by passing car headlights. Naked tree branches jute like fingers towards her as she briskly walked home. Ao had decided to alter her route home that night. She was eager to avoid another meeting with that woman. Her dark eyes started back and forth at traffic lights, searching and scanning for that woman in the brown coat. When pedestrian footsteps fell behind her, AA would either cross the road or turn around and try another path. All her senses were heightened, save for her sense of direction. She had wandered down a few too many unfamiliar streets and managed to get herself lost. She was faced with a difficult decision: turn her phone on and open the Maps application or try to guess her way back home. She decided to go with the phone. Listening to music would calm her down. As an added bonus, it was her phone, and just because she had a nuisance caller didn't mean she would yield to never using it again. A tirade of voicemail messages, missed call notifications appeared on her screen. She sighed. Io opened the Map application and began walking in the right direction. She played some music and began to unclench for a moment. Io stopped dead in her tracks when her upbeat music was replaced by the genetic trill of her ringtone. She debated internally to answer or cancel the call. She reminded herself of Er's advice: don't give her oxygen. Why so many calls and messages? What could she be saying? Now curiosity began to bloom inside her. She continued walking and questioning the motives of the stranger. The phone began to ring again. Iko instantly canceled the call. She felt anger and irritation rising inside. Her stress was mounting. She marched into a convenience store and on a whim she decided to buy cigarettes. She had always enjoyed the smell of her father's cigarette wafting into her parents' home as he sat by the sliding door sipping a can of beer on a hot day. She longed for the comforts of home. She reached into the chiller and picked up a can of her own. Ayako made it home before another downpour. Alone on her balcony, she paced back and forth smoking and sipping her father's favorite beer, watching the direction of the rain beneath the street lights. Nothing but rainfall could be heard. As she contemplated her own situation, she stared at the empty field across from her house. It was showing signs of waterlogging. The rain was unrelenting. Amidst the swirl of rainfall, she thought she could see shapes moving in the distant field. She threw her cigarette over the balcony and watched the red embers disappear into the darkness. As she re-entered her apartment, she heard the phone ringing in her bedroom. Out of mild inebriation, or perhaps curiosity, she decided to torment herself by listening to the voicemails. Each message was rife with the predictable demands of more and more origami cranes. The voice became increasingly irritated and demanding. AA reached the most recent message, one which she received a mere 2 minutes prior. There was a sharp intake of breath followed by "How dare you, haven't been working at all. Have you?" the voice screamed. "Don't you think I'm aware of what you're doing? Mia's done dying. The least you can do is help by making more cranes. We need 87. You smoke and you drink on your balcony while Mia lies on her bed. You selfish." Iko screamed and hurled the phone across the room. Tears filled her eyes as the message continued to play across the room. The phone hissed static noises and shrieks as it lay on the floor. Her breath was caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her chest. "She knows where I live." Ao whimpered, bringing a hand to cover her trembling lips. She scrambled to her front door and dead-bolted it. She contemplated looking through the peephole, but the thought of seeing her caller peering back at her was too frightening. AA raced to the balcony's sliding door and slammed the lock shut and drew the curtains. She ran to her bed. Oh, that safe haven from childhood where monsters would never dare invade. She dived under the duvet and sobbed as her phone lay by the front door vibrating on the hardwood floor. "My advice to you would be to ensure your doors and windows are locked every night, and most importantly, ignore any calls or messages you receive." Miss, the officer stated in a rehearsed draw. The midday sun shone through the slather blinds and created bars of shadow and lights on the reception desk. His stony face didn't harbor a trace of concern for the trembling young lady. In front of him, Eiko stood aghast. She had learned very recently that ignoring a problem doesn't make it disappear. She could feel tears beginning to sting the corners of her eyes, but wouldn't allow them to be wasted on this cold obelisk of a man. Unable to seem rude, she muttered a thank you and left the police station through day and night. I kept an eye over her shoulder, nervously watching for her stalker. She could feel eyes on her as she walked the streets, while she waited on tables at work, and as she made her way home, she was filled with more and more questions each day. Did I write my address down in her gritty little book? I'm sure I didn't. How could she see me on my third-floor balcony in the driving rain? Over time, Io became increasingly nervous to leave her apartment. She lived with the lights off, eager to give the impression that no one was home. At first she ate nothing but instant food, ramen cups of soup and pasta, and then nothing at all. Her complexion began to grow pale and psoriasis bloomed in patches of her skin, causing it to flake. She had neglected her studies and began to miss shifts at work. For Io, the mundane had turned into the petrifying nights were the hardest for the young girl from the countryside. She was used to quiet nights filled with the chirps of bugs. Tokyo was different. Every noise racked her senses: unknown footfall on metal stairs of her building, voices in the streets below, squeaks and creaks of something unseen. Although she was terrified, she never buckled. Io had committed herself to the idea of keeping her lights off to make it seem as if she wasn't home and she wasn't going to change her mind, but the noises, they were far worse. In the darkness, she wouldn't use a torch to get from room to room and unplugged everything which had a standby light. She didn't dream of touching her phone again. Had she turned it on, she would have found a number of calls and messages from someone else besides her stalker. Her mother. Ao's parents had grown concerned as they hadn't heard from her in a number of days. Ao's birthday was next month, and her mother had been trying to get in touch with her to plan a visit. The storm outside was worsening. Wind and rain lashed her windows like ravenous tongues. Flashes of lightning partially illuminated her apartment. A crack of boom breached the rumbling storm and jumped her out of her skin. Iko sat there with her neck craned, peering downwards to the floor. She was on edge for some innate reason. She silently drummed her fingers on the left side of her chair. Was that knocking or just the storm? She prayed for the latter. Once again, knocking came louder. She sat frozen, staring towards the door. Light flickered beneath the door as if to indicate feet were on the other side. Again the knocking came louder. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated her apartment. Again. Her lips quivered. She clasped her hands to her mouth. She dar make a sound. There's nobody here. There's nobody home. Please go away. She internally chanted. Yet the knocking persisted. I echo, how many have you made? The familiar voice asked from behind the door. It called her name tunefully, like a mother calling her child, like her mother. It wasn't angry this time, but it was still beyond terrifying for Ayako, feeling the urge to scream rising inside. Aiko bit her fist. Ayako truly believed that there was still a chance that the stalker would think that there was no one home, just like hiding under the duvet. The ghosts and demons think you aren't there. Her teeth dug sharply into her knuckle and forefinger. As the voice continued to call her name in that tuneful way, a slamming sound suddenly began. She's trying to break the door open. She actually wants to come in and do who knows what. To me, Io's mind screamed. Ayako lamented in silence and allowed tears to stream down her face, scared. The sound of wiping them away or sniffing would alert her unwanted visitor. Why did I write my name in that book? She roared in her mind. The short bursts of clamming continued. She thought about grabbing her phone and calling the police in that instance, but a much more immediate and harrowing thought jumped to the forefront of her mind. Is the door just on the chain? Is that the sound of opening and closing? Ao whimpered with her arms outstretched as she tiptoed closer to the door there in the hallway. Just before the gang cam, she saw her door opening and closing. Rain had soaked the floor. The stranger was still wearing her face mask and brown coat. She was grunting as she was pushing her weight against the door. She hadn't noticed Iko because she was transfixed on smashing the door open. Io thought about screaming for help. She was so dismally disappointed that none of her neighbors had come to see what the noise was about. They're ignoring it. A voice inside whispered. The eyes above the face mask locked onto Ayako as lightning struck. In that instance, fight or flight kicked in. Io ran to her door screaming, slid on the rainwater, and forced her body weight up against the door. The rain-soaked door chain was hanging on by a single screw. Io's strange wasn't a match for the stranger's. The door was slightly forced open again. Let me in. I've come to collect them. Give me the cranes. Why don't you give them to me? Kamiya is dying. The awful woman demanded. I don't have any. Go away. I'm calling the police. Iko screamed back. None. The stranger's voice sounded in human fingers craned around the frame of the door, and into Ao's apartment. Ao shrieked and shoulder barged the door onto them. A scream of pain filled Io's ears. There were fingers in her door at that moment and Io wanted them to be broken cut off. She pushed harder and harder on the door. Blood spurted through the surface of the skin, followed by a splinter of bone. They still twisted and coiled towards her like blood-soaked serpents with bone dorsal fins. Aa heard the maniac sobbing and wailing. She relieved the pressure and the bloody fingers withdrew. "You crushed my fingers. I'm nothing but a charitable woman. How could you? I'll be back. You'll slip up again and next time I'll get in and I'll get those 479 cranes you promised. Maybe you'll have to make more, because how can I possibly make any now? I'll be back to get what's owed. I'll come back. I'll come back." Aa used the last of her energy to deadbolt the lock and then collapsed. She will reply when she gets a chance. Don't worry, she's a big girl now. Mr. Eto assured his wife. Well, I feel a lot better if we could just find out for ourselves. Come on, get in the car. I can't rest until I know she's all right. She replied, pleading with her eyes. Mr. Eto joined his wife in his 91 Suzuki mini truck. He adjusted his mirrors, gave an upward half smile and started the ignition. It's only 2 hours to Tokyo. Weak, malnourished and sleep-deprived, Eiko sat vigilantly with her back against the door, unmoving despite the pain. Several nights had passed since the onslaught of the lady in the brown coat. She hadn't followed through with that threat of her return, and yet pangs of hunger stung Ao's stomach. Her skin flaked and her hair had faded to a ghostly gray. Around Akako sat hundreds of immaculately folded cranes. In congregation, Ao's fingers were scored by paper cuts and her hands were rendered claw-like, yet she diligently continued performing a breathy head count. Occasionally, the cranes all faced their skeletal creator watching silently. Like members of a jury, Aa guarded that door with all of her body's depleting resources, clutching the door handle with one raised blood-drained arm. She thought of calling for help or calling the police, but knew the instant she moved from the door it would burst open, or once again, her calls for help and advice would be ignored. She tried to decide which idea was more frightening as sleep came to take her. Try calling again. I already told you her phone is turned off. Well, let's get the landlord. He must have a key. We can't stand here knocking all morning. There seems to be something against the door. The landlord stated, well, I'll help you push. Then offered Mr. Eto. As the door edged open, Mrs. Ito saw a bony arm and admitted a pained cry. Ao, wake up. Her father boomed. Ao opened her eyes and was immediately blinded by the morning sun. She could hear sobbing and felt strong arms around her. She made a feeble attempt to lash out at her captors. Before realizing that it was her parents, she closed her eyes again and smiled. For the first time in a long while, you're coming home with us. What has happened to my little girl? Her mother questioned. Welcome back, Mr. Merceau. We are pleased with Ao's recovery and we suspected some mental health issues, but as the months progressed, we're confident that it is not the case. She often spoke of a woman stalking her, and we suspected paranoia, schizophrenia, but she has sufficiently proven our initial diagnosis to be incorrect. She has calmed over the months and has finally accepted that no one is pursuing her. Mr. and Mrs. Eto were sat in the doctor's office. Mr. Eto glanced around the room and his eyes landed on a photo of the doctor and his son fishing, unless it wasn't in her head. The police are still investigating the case, Mr. Eto said sternly. His eyes met the doctor's again. Of course, as it stands, she seems to be healthy and I'm certain she wouldn't be a danger to herself or others, which is why I'm happy to sign the discharge paperwork today. Well, that is wonderful news, exclaimed Mrs. Eto. I will say, Mr. Eto, the less said about this lady she constantly referred would go a long way in aiding her recovery. Perhaps she's real. Perhaps she isn't. It would be in everybody's best interest to ignore the matter. Wouldn't you agree? Mr. Eto looked at the bespectacled doctor and solemnly nodded. Yes, of course, doctor. May we see her now? Asked Mrs. Eto, while watching raindrops slithering down the wire-meshed window pane. Absolutely. Nurse Obata is walking her over from the ward. Now alarm bells rang in a dist corridor. Mr. and Mrs. Eto ignored them and continued to wait patiently for their daughter to arrive in Dr. Cie's office. The doctor's phone began to ring. No, that's impossible. Well, yes, I understand. I'll be there momentarily, he said to the unseen caller. Mr. and Mrs. Eto watched on through the viewing window, helpless to the situation, as Io thrashed madly in the hospital bed. The nurses amassed around her attempting to hold her limb down. She kicked and scratched and screamed at them. Dear Kamua primed a needle and aimed it towards Ayako's arm. He pulled the plunger and Io's thrashes and screams turned to listless kicks and whimpered cries before fading out, now sedated. The nurses and the doctor joined Ayo's parents at the viewing window. What happened to her? I thought you said she was making progress. Mr. Ito asked angrily. Nurse Oda, do tell us, snapped Arkam. Nurse Obata's face held a look of concern, and she seemed as confused as Mr. and Mrs. Eto as she recounted what had happened. Yes, doctor, I was walking Ayo through the garden. She became agitated as the rain fell. A lady I hadn't seen before on the grounds walked over and offered Ayo an umbrella, and we took it gratefully, and then she said to Aiko, Mia is dead. Let's see who makes cranes for you. Now you go next. Anna walked the streets often by herself. She didn't mind if it was night or day. She was always confident in her surroundings, and just because she hadn't ever visited Tokyo before didn't mean that she would change her attitude. She felt independent and happy on her own while traveling. She stood waiting for a light to change green, staring at the vespertine sky. She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket and held it up and wiped raindrops away. As she looked at her notifications, she felt a sharp prod in her back. She turned angrily to meet the gaze of the one who dared to disturb her. A stranger stood before her. A face mask covered her mouth. Could you do something for me, miss? I have a small request, but if you were to fulfill it, we would be ever so grateful, asked the stranger wearing a long brown coat. Anna thought this is a new one. She had seen busco street performers and cosplayers, but she had never seen a steely-eyed lone woman referring to herself as Ao is in the hospital. She's been stricken with a very rare heart disease, and the doctors are baffled of how she might have caught it. Anna nodded empathetically. She had volunteered in the past and was touched by the plight of the young woman. Besides, it was only a small record quest. Hey, it won't kill me, sure, I'll make you an origami crane. The stranger's eyes widened. Well, thanks everyone if you managed to make it to the end of that one. That was an urban legend. It's about this request to make cranes and then somehow you end up in hospital and somebody else is making cranes for you to get better the next victim. Basically they love their cilia kind of curses, like the rang on the videotape and stuff like that. I wrote that in Japan. A lot of the stuff in that story is based on what I would see where I lived, like the field where it was getting waterlogged and rainy. There was a huge field near where I lived like this, the streets. You'd walk down, pausing at the traffic lights and stuff. Anyway, I hoped you liked it. I will go back to the true scary stories and the ghost stories and woods and stuff like that. Don't worry, this is not a departure from that kind of stuff. It's just one I thought I'd throw online whilst I'm on holiday. Yep, right now I'm in Japan. I'm probably a couple of beers in at this time. It's being uploaded or I'm sound asleep. I haven't figured out the time zone quite yet, but yeah, anyway. I hope you enjoyed it and let me know if you'd like to hear more of my own stories. I'll see you soon.